You're listening to The Audit, presented by IT Audit Labs.
All right, welcome to The Audit. I'm here today with Nick Mellum and our guest, Matt Starland. How's everybody doing today?
Excellent here.
Doing really good.
Good. Thanks for joining us, Matt. I just want to start off our recording here, give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself, where you're involved in security, what types of projects you've done, and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. Matt Starland, been in the IT industry for a little over 20 years and maybe even longer if you include childhood. My dad had a computer business back in the early 90s. So he was kind of teaching me how to work on computers and build them and fix them. So going all the way from the old 8088s, 286s, 386s. So really got a good chance to see kind of the evolution of home computers. And then that kind of created the passion to go into the IT industry full time. So start off with help desk, went from a help desk to a sysadmin. Primarily working in the messaging side of the IT industry, so Microsoft Exchange. Been in some big organizations from 10,000 plus users, dealing with their email systems, and then started getting in the consulting world of divestitures, acquisitions, and my mergers, using that skill set of email skills, and probably worked for close to 30 or 31 different companies, big Fortune 500 companies, helping them with their those mergers and acquisitions. And so, granted, I've been on the operations side for 20 years. Security was more of a secondary thing, and kind of saw the writing on the wall here 5-6 years ago with the explosion of everything being interconnected and just the amount of breaches and security issues going on, and decided to kind of jump ship out of the operations side of the world and go full time into security. And so now I'm working as a full-time cybersecurity architect. So a lot of projects using that operation side and implementation side of the world that I've been a part of, using those skill sets in the cybersecurity world to implement technologies to help secure organizations. So, integrating like multi-factor authentication into many applications, helping lock down and secure Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, privileged access management, a lot of different, identity kind of based tools. So not so much on the red team side, but more the blue team. And I think that's my passion there is more on the blue team side, just because of being in the operations field for so long and building things. It's kind of my drive and goal. But now it's taking that building things and how do we use those things to protect and secure an infrastructure. So, but I would say that's kind of been my background. And for hobbies and interest outside of the cybersecurity industry, I would say is probably the newest thing is 3D printing. Been doing that for about a year now, and I think that kind of fills that need again of building and creating things and finding solutions to problems. So that's been quite the journey learning that, and and also pretty much any of my kids' hobbies. So it's become now my hobby. So that takes up a lot of time now these days too. So anybody that's listening that has kids, you can attest to where you might have been out golfing a lot or doing a lot of personal things, and so now they're at an age where they're doing those things. So I've kind of shifted my role in attending them and also teaching them new stuff. Whether it's IT or sports. So yeah, it's kind of my life in a nutshell here.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. And really, the reason we invited you on here is because, with your expertise in kind of the architecture of cybersecurity and your kind of engineering experience, right, you kind of sit in that hybrid role of developing and building those tools, also coming up with new solutions to bring in new items, bring in new technologies, looking at kind of the broader scale of infrastructure. as kind of an architect. So you kind of sit that hybrid role. And today, Nick and myself just wanted to really sit down and talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the security space, whether it's modern news stories that we want to hit on, and just kind of talk about, what we're seeing, how we react to it, what we think that kind of means for security as a whole, and just kind of bring some of our own technical know-how into it. I would like to start off talking about a news article that I saw this morning that came out on Bleeping Computer. I saw it this morning on the 20th. It came out January 19th, so a day before today, 2023. And it's another article about T-Mobile getting hacked and allowing these hackers to access and steal the personal data of like 37 million accounts. We'll put the link to the article in the show notes here. But again, it kind of sits in that gap of things that as blue team architects and engineers, we touch on a daily basis, and then has an implication to, I would say, probably most modern companies that have any sort of web presence. And it's not the first hack that T-Mobile's been a part of. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, do you work with API technologies? What are some of the kind of modern implications of that? And with this being kind of their 8th major breach in the last 5 years, what does that kind of mean for policy-wise for these companies who continually allow for hackers to kind of get in? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is an interesting scenario. It's just, you've seen the evolution of going from installing applications on premises to maybe back, 15, 20 years ago, where you didn't have, cloud's always been around. I guess we call it colo, data centers, where people would have spin up their own stuff in somebody else's data center, and then you'd create a VPN tunnel. Some of that still exists today, but now with, the landscape of your big major cloud providers of Google, AWS, and, Azure or Microsoft Azure, a lot of now they use the different these types of APIs that integrate into your platforms, and then you provide some form of a security key, a token, certificates, or some credentials to provide access. And what I've seen usually when you get these documentation from vendors of here's how we connect our hosted environment to your environment. Their goal is to integrate as quickly and as seamlessly as possible. And so when you look at this documentation, if you're not looking at it through the lens of maybe a cybersecurity professional, you're looking at it from the operation side of the world, and you've got executives that are breathing down your neck to get something implemented by X date. Sometimes, that security mindset starts to, you're not viewing things as much as through a security lens as you should be, and you just kind of take the vendor's word for granted, and you just implement as is. Well, when seeing these, you got to really look at what type of permissions are they asking. So for example, let's say it's a type of technology that integrates with your email system, and it needs to maybe read calendar data, or somehow plug into your mailbox, so that way it can seamlessly send emails from your, Exchange mailbox. A lot of these will just default to, give us all access to all your mailboxes. And if you don't catch that, think about this. It's now you gave them some sort of a token, security key, account, whatever it is, that has full mailbox rights across your whole environment, when only maybe a particular department needed that application. It wasn't an organization-wide application. And so it's all about, reducing your, your risk. So why did we give this application or this, that API access to several hundreds of mailboxes when we only needed 10? So, now if those credentials are leaked, or they weren't fine-tuned to just be a particular IP address to make that connection, anywhere in the world or anywhere in the US, as long as they got that credential, could, in theory, access all of those mailboxes when it only needed 5 or 10. So then you get into the aspect of, well, those 5 or 10 might not have had sensitive data in them, but maybe the other 500 that it had access to had sensitive data. And so it really comes down to one thing that I push all the time in the organization that I work at is least privilege access. Sometimes that's easier said than done, because you start to get into a problem of finding that fine balance between operations and security. Security, we look at it as let's lock down, but then it chokes the life out of the organization to maybe effectively do business. But then at the same time too, if you leave it too open, then you run into this kind of maybe situation. Not saying that this is exactly how the T-Mobile breach happened, but typically it can help you reduce your exposure by following that kind of least privilege access. So, the point I'm trying to get at is it's met with all these different cloud technologies and different APIs connecting in. You really need to keep a close eye on one, what type of permissions the vendor is really asking for, and take a second look at it and just see the platform that it's connecting to, making sure that it is following, that principle of least privilege. But two, this goes back to your kind of your procurement process too, and how you're evaluating that organization and what type of security program they have in place to help reduce your risk. So yeah, when you see these types of things, 37 million current postpaid and prepaid customer accounts, and it happens day in and day out. You go to bleepingcomputer.com or any other major web, you almost want to, go live off in Alaska and live off grid sometimes, but I know this isn't the world we live in. It's becoming more interconnected. So I really find it's all about how can you reduce your risk and, protecting yourself or your organization, that is, following that principle of least privilege. So yeah, I would say that's kind of my thoughts on it. Is just, I'm not saying that there wasn't some other form of, malicious activity that they found, maybe a vulnerability, but I'm going to say most likely my 2 cents is that it could have been just over privilege. I don't know what's your thoughts on.
So
your kind of
I guess
take
Matt, that's awesome. Great explanation there on your thoughts. If we cut the top off of this issue and we look in to see what's actually happening, if you had to start pointing fingers, would it go back to people being lackadaisical, know-how? I mean, what are we dealing with, an issue of people just not knowing what they're doing, lack of, initiative or tools? Because I think the tools are getting pretty good right now, right? We've got a lot of stuff that's really good at hunting these kind of issues down. We talked about least privileges, which we would agree with you, obviously. But if we, like I've said, if we take the top off and look down at the actual problem here, what do you have any thoughts on what is contributing to this?
Yeah, I part of it is, I think it could be process. Maybe sometimes the organizations become so large that the departments don't know what the left hand is doing. The left and the right hand doesn't know what it's doing, and making sure that you have talented individuals that know the technologies really well and put them in that consulting or leadership position to be able to educate or help develop processes for the lower aspect. Because granted, it might come in this, a request to have this API, come in at a top level where you have your architects reviewing it and seeing it, and maybe then an engineer at a lower level might be doing the implementation, might not have the same, set of skill sets that the architect had in implementing, and might have either missed a permission or maybe the architect didn't properly document something in making sure that the engineer clearly knew what to do as well. So, so going back to, like I said, it's a process thing. So, I mean, it's and also making sure that your risk management and, procurement is properly vetting these things. So I think it comes down to really it's just process, I believe, so we can get huge, we can have all sorts of fun tools and everything, but there's some basics that we can easily miss from just having a foundational approach to making sure we hire qualified individuals, and also building the appropriate process procedures to make sure that information from the top is, processed down to those lower levels that might be implementing it. So, because I'll admit, early on in my career, if I was at that admin level and implementing something, I was just kind of here's the set of instructions. All right, go ahead and implement. And so if you have that, a certain level of architect or technical skill set, viewing that information immediately and then making sure they articulate and give appropriate information maybe to the engineer at that lower level that's implementing it. So I don't know. I think that's a key thing there, is having just appropriate processes and procedures in place.
Totally. And that makes sense. And for anyone who hasn't read the article, right, I mean, we're just kind of spitballing on possible ways that this could have happened and gotten away with. They didn't actually release yet, as of today, how the API was exploited, but essentially the attackers exploited an API, which is just a kind of web connection, typically into internal data through usually like a web request. Sometimes it's a little bit different. So they're not 100% sure how, but it sounds like about 37 million people were affected, and things that were gathered by the attackers were people's phone numbers, number of phone numbers that were on their account emails, possibly the person's name, their date of birth, billing address, all of those types of, personal identifiable information. That's the stuff that these threat actors were able to get a hold of, which is no small amount of data, right? That's still a major kind of privacy breach as far as individuals go. But, a few of the things that I was thinking of while you were talking is, with some of the blue team work that I've done in the past, could this be a misunderstanding of new tool sets, right? As I think of working with, implementing cloud services, whether it's AWS, Azure, I guess those are the big two typically, but with implementing those 2 or 3 different cloud services at a person's company, or for a large company or small company, the way that networking is done, the way that connections are made into the cloud, the way that cloud resources communicate with one another is significantly different than how your physical networking infrastructure communicates, right? When you're connecting routers and switches, I mean, you can see the wires, you can connect the wires, that the data is going to cross that cable. Whereas sometimes when you're working in a cloud environment, you set up an endpoint, you set up another endpoint, you think, oh, if they talk to one another, it's just going to go right through my cloud instance. Whereas a lot of times it's going to go out through the wide internet and then back into your cloud instance. And there's extra configuration and pieces you have to do in your cloud platform to ensure all your data that you want to stay inside stays inside. So I don't know, maybe this is a good question for both of you. Is it possible that the training and the education and the pieces on how to securely implement these types of platforms just isn't caught up to where the business wants it to be at this point? Are we falling behind there? And then a second question I'll just pose right away, and feel free to answer one or both. Typically, when there's a breach like this, what I like to think of is, there's a major breach, the safest place to be is usually with that breached company. After there's an incident on an airline security shoots up, and the safest time to fly is typically right after that happens, right? Security tends to be the same way. Right after there's a major breach, usually there's a lot of money poured into security and you get a lot better tooling and detection and a safer environment. So interesting that T-Mobile has had so many issues in the last so many years, 8 major breaches in 5 years, and it continues to happen. So curious what your thoughts are, both on kind of the cloud training side and then also the sinking ship and having issues.
So
yeah, I got a couple of thoughts on that. So one, it's funny that you bring up the whole, I can talk from this cloud endpoint to the other cloud endpoint, and I'm good to go, and it's all said and done. I'm good to go, but there's other things that are going on behind the scenes there. Where when you start building out your infrastructure in a cloud environment like that, it gets a little tricky, because like you said, you lose sight of that. Oh, I know this physical cable talks here, or connects here, and this connects over there, and so I know the paths come through these channels or this physical media. But in the cloud, it is like we kind of make this joke that it's maybe part of Microsoft's magic sauce or whatever going on behind the scenes. Like how does my VM that I built talking to this Azure SQL as a service kind of ordeal or blob, and it's not necessarily using my VNets and everything that I spun up. Like, how is this communicating? And there's some confusion. At least I'm not as deep as some of that networking technology, some of my counterparts that I've worked with and everything. But I always like to see that when it comes down to building some of that infrastructure, testing and validating what can I get to it from, and what can't I, and there's a lot of when these technologies, when you spin up all these different cloud technologies that they give you, it's kind of like plug and play ordeal. It reminds me of Windows prior to Server 2008, or Microsoft Server, like 2003 and 2000. When you install those operating systems, they came fully wide open. Everything's installed, all the services are running, and then finally in 2008, when you installed to that server, it was stripped down. Like, you had to install IIS after that. You had to install, do all these extra things so those services then are available. It was kind of following that least privilege model. And now with the cloud, because of how complicated it is and how quickly these cloud providers are trying to compete with each other and just boom, spinning new technologies left and right, it's hard for people, a lot of technologists, to keep up in how these things are configured. So it seems to be that they are just leaving them wide open out of the gate by default. So that way you can get your stuff, up and running as quickly as possible. And then all of a sudden you realize later on, like, whoa, this blob storage was wide open to the internet, and I was using this to store, some protected data or whatever it might be. This is the way some of the places I've seen before, and they didn't know about it. And so there's a lot of now different techniques, or maybe been out, like, for example, Palo Alto's, that rings a bell, is their Prisma Cloud. I think, Prisma Cloud, in which that is, designed not to give them a particular plug here or anything like that. That's just one example of many, but they scan for those kind of known insecurities that these cloud providers are, creating out of the box, so you can quickly set things up. That's something to bear in mind when you're, with these cloud technologies, and making sure that when you're building things, go through a validation process. Again, going back to that process procedure, make sure, can I get to it internally? Can I get to it externally? Do I have a test environment, in the cloud as well? And if that's not networked, can I get to that other environment's, cloud resource? So, going through your validation procedures, or using a particular tool that's designed to scan for those things, make sure they're locked down, and then move on. But also having reoccurring scans, so that way over privileges, something doesn't become over privileged over the time. So going back to how they've shown how many breaches in the last 4 years? Eight,
I think, yeah.
To me, my thoughts is that it comes down to maybe a company structure or something. I mean, you got to have management behind you. So you got to have your upper management recognize that we've got an issue here, and now what do we need to do to fix it? Going through that incident response, best practices of, okay, what are lessons learned? and now let's throw some money at this or time and get these things fixed, and where was that, weak chain, the link, in the chain, where's that weak part of it, and trying to resolve that. Was it a personnel issue? Was it a technology issue? Is it going to be perfect after, this? Maybe not, but maybe it took them some time, and maybe they're taking time because there is, it's a money issue. I wouldn't think so, but again, I think you got to throw resources at it. It really comes down to upper management and get everybody in line and organized. I don't know. I think that's kind of my thoughts behind it, and in all the different organizations I previously worked at. So.
Yeah, I think, well, I'll jump in here too, and I'll probably take it a step further, and I don't mean to be super cutthroat here. When I'm reading through the article, the first thing that come to my mind is personnel. It's know-how, right? I think one of T-Mobile's potential biggest issues, and potentially a lot of other organizations around the country or the world, we've seen a changing of the guard, right? The pioneers of security are starting to retire. They're starting to leave the space. So the baton is being passed, and it's not that the younger crowd doesn't know what they're doing. We've lost that leadership where we're picking up the baton. And I'm saying we because, it's probably in front of us, right? We haven't got to that point, but it is that fundamental know-how, right? We've lost kind of the head that's been driving this, and now T-Mobile is kind of left holding the bag as far as these tools, the know-how, the process and procedures. It's really everything. But from a holistic view, it is a personnel issue as far as I'm concerned, without trying to get too technical. And that's kind of where the compliance stuff comes in as well, right? We can have all these great tools, but if we don't have the people to maintain it on a daily basis, we've lost our direction, is how I think of it.
Yeah, I think it's complexity. We've got, it's kind of, I guess the best example I give, I remember when I was getting involved in the 90s, at least in the computer industry, and at least the area I grew up in was very blue collared, not very technical in that IT industry by any means. I mean, not saying that there wasn't people, but it just wasn't always one of the primary, economical drivers in the area that I grew up in. And, when somebody, I remember hearing, like, oh, computers, and they just expected you knew web developing, app dev, networking, all of the above. And maybe that was, maybe because of some of the smaller organizations that I'd seen, maybe some of the larger ones at the time, companies, wasn't the case, but at least that's what I had seen. And so when you're looked at that as, oh, IT, there's so many different areas to specialize in. It's kind of like the medical industry. It's like, oh yeah, you're a nurse. Well, people start to assume that brain surgery and all these in chiropractic care, or all the different specialties that exist. And it's like, no, I'm not going to let the primary care physician do brain surgery on me. There's a reason why that in this IT industry, it's grown to all these different niches because of how complex it's getting and everything. And so I believe that part of this is it goes, again, hiring the right people to do the right type of job. And part of that is because of just how complex the IT industry is getting. So, finding qualified people to do this particular cybersecurity job or this particular help desk job. And then it also comes down to, training also your personnel. So not just IT, it's a personnel thing. So I don't know. That's kind of how it seems to be getting with all these cloud technologies too. And just technology is growing so fast. It's hard to keep up. I mean, it's you got your full-time job, but then it's also maybe a part-time job outside of your full-time job, just reading and educating yourself and always keeping up to speed on everything. And I think it's just complexity is what's the killer behind this. And companies want to make money and they want to grow as fast as they can. And security is looked at as an
afterthought.
Yeah, well, but if we do this, it's going to take us 6 more months to implement, or so sometimes some of that leadership makes the decision to accept the risk, and sometimes is accepting that risk more costly. So
yeah, I think one great point that I picked up on, Matt, that you were just saying is, with companies want to make money, they're so concerned with hiring that one jack of all trade security guy to come in that can do everything. In reality, what they need to be looking for is 3 or 4 guys. Some guy that's good at compliance, some guy that's your threat hunter, somebody that's your processes and procedures and your know-how, or your red team or blue team. So you have all these different things, and instead of thinking of it, they want the one guy that's okay at everything, instead of getting studs in every area that can really shore up these potential issues that we're seeing now.
Yeah, agreed.
And you mentioned money, and you both just mentioned money and the company, and they're interested in making money, right? So here's my biggest kind of pet peeve with all of this is, if you've listened to our other episodes where we're talking about data privacy in the modern world, right? And social media companies where you're providing them your data and it's pretty obvious that they're using that for benefit. But with a company like this and with other companies like this, when you're giving them your information, you're giving them your address, you're giving them your credit card information, your billing address, your name, social security, like you name it, they ask for it. When this many breaches of personal private information have happened in the last 5 years to a company that's so large, it doesn't seem like they're losing when these things happen, if that makes sense. So they're supposed to be there to protect individual data that they collect and hold on to for business purposes. When that data gets lost, where's the repercussions back against the company? I mean, there's always the argument that free economics, right? You could drop T-Mobile, but can you afford to drop T-Mobile and go somewhere that's maybe more expensive or go somewhere cheaper, right? And that's the thing is, are they too big? And do there need to be policies and things in place that hold them to account when this type of thing happens, right? And there's always a civil lawsuit and something that goes on in a case like this. And if you buy into it and you fill out the paperwork and you make your claim, you'll get a $50 check in the mail, right? Like, is $50, 2.5 years after the fact, good repercussions for you who just had your email address? Somebody take that, and whether it was sold online or not, somebody knows that then about you. And are you comfortable with that? And where's kind of the repercussion come into play? Does there need to be some sort of a policy that when it happens this many times in this short of a period, and they're obviously, well, maybe they're taking it seriously, but it keeps happening, right? So again, we keep saying they need manpower, they need know-how, they need this. There's ways to shore it up. Is it just disregard for the care of their users' data? Does there need to be something, I don't want to say government, but there need to be some sort of framework out there that protects individuals as more and more of our data keeps ending up at these companies and then ends up on the dark web because these companies keep losing it, right?
Yeah. I think, this, is part of it. Like, I started to get into my libertarian views here and making sure, like going back to what you said, where having government step in, it's like, well, yeah, you got to have the parent, I'm thinking, when I say parent, meaning family-based kind of parenting, it's like, here, come in, discipline the child. But then I'm also thinking to myself, well, I also want to be careful of that slippery slope of, we've probably been down a slippery slope for a while now, or in many, and we'll call it quote unquote free market in our country for a while, but it's that's a different topic for a different day that we could go down that rabbit hole. But I think I would go back to is this is where the media and or the news or personal responsibility comes into place too. And when I say media news, making sure that this isn't just on bleepingcomputer.com. Like, where's the CNN? Where's the the Fox, the Daily Wires, all these different news outlets. I know they're focused so heavily on the politics, but let's also take a look at the cybersecurity aspect, because I think the more and more you would get people aware of this versus them just getting a random piece of paper in the mail that says, hey, your information was breached. We're doing everything we can for it. Here's your $50 and we'll give you 2 years of free counseling. You can see a therapist. You can go to this. There's a pastor down the road here too you can talk to, and maybe everything will be okay.
I free Netflix for 6 months.
Yeah, here we'll give you. Yeah, we'll give you our new T-Mobile package. We're including Disney Plus, by the way, so maybe it'll make you feel better. I really think it comes down to, again, personal responsibility. So, but also as a culture type thing. Meaning, we need to get more. Maybe we as a cybersecurity industry got to get more involved in educating the general public on what's going on. And then as people see this, where do I put my money? Well, heck, I don't want to. I'm not going to, give T-Mobile my money now. Verizon hasn't shown anything, at least, or AT&T. So I'm going to take my money and move it elsewhere, because again, money talks. So if they start losing customers, whoa, okay, now we're going to start, maybe really figuring out what's going on. Why isn't Verizon and AT&T and other organizations seeing this? Well, maybe they are, and they just don't know it yet either. It goes back to maybe the tool sets they're using, they aren't identifying these breaches in the same nature that maybe T-Mobile is. But and let's say they are seeing, they're able to stop this or have their, poop in a group, as we'll say, and they are preventing this. So I think that's another wake up call. So I think it comes down to educating the public and then letting them, take their money and invest it in companies that will maybe take care of them better with their information, but then also not what that company is going to do for them. Going back to like JFK, what can you do for your country? But it's more or less, what can you do for yourself? What are those things that you can do as an individual to protect your identity? What are those types of technologies and process procedures that you can do to limit your exposure? Making sure you don't use password 123456 on all of your 150 different accounts that you have across Disney Plus, Netflix, Hulu, T-Mobile, Direct TV, etc. And then when that happens, one of those are breached. Well, now they also got access to other maybe additional information. So, I think it's a kind of education, and also taking personal responsibility. I hate to say that, personal responsibility, because it wasn't necessarily the customer's fault. But that's right. It goes back to what can we educate the customer about, what they can do to limit their exposure, but then also give them the power to, here are other organizations that you can invest your money in and reduce your risk. Goes back to my previous statement, risk reduction. It's as with it is driving a car. Why do I wear a seatbelt? I know I could possibly die in my car driving down the road, but I know that wearing a seatbelt is going to reduce that risk greatly. So now how do I take that same mindset and put it into technology for my personal needs too, on downloading applications and purchasing services from providers like T-Mobile? They're speechless, folks.
I know.
It's nodding left and right here. If you could see them, they're nodding. They know.
Just wild, getting wild. One thing that comes to my mind too is just that now that we're moving into kind of a new age, it's like companies need to be living in a world of, it's like a matter of time before you get somebody knocking on your door versus, oh, it's never going to happen to me. And we've talked about this in, previous episodes about what you can do. And man, that's a great point. Like, you really need to start looking out for yourself. And it's interesting that you brought that up, because just this morning I went to renew my driver's license. And one of the questions on the sheet, they wanted your full social security number written out. Right. So, and I didn't do it. Right. I just left it blank until I got there, and she's keying in the information. right? I give her what she needs instead of writing it down. But I'm drawing the two back together because we're being so out of sight, out of mind. We're getting in our own way. And that's exactly what's happening here, Matt. Everything you're explaining, we keep tripping ourselves. We're not using these tools in the way they should be. We're not training our staff in the way that we should be, educating, continuing education to pass that baton. But just one thing that came to my mind when you were going, speaking there is what I was thinking about.
So in other words, we're all going to go buy a big piece of land in Alaska.
Yep.
Take all of our data with us and just live off grid.
Folks, just lock your credit. Just freeze your credit.
Your new social media in Alaska will be your furry friends, and it's called nature. You'll be, your instant messaging is a homing pigeon and smoke signals.
Yeah, and during the next data breach, you can just tell everybody, I don't care, I don't need it anymore.
Well, unfortunately, it is funny. I don't want to get too much digress too much, but it is funny to see some of the articles and reports, things I've been reading too, like how that lifestyle is actually growing quite fast. But for those who want to have the nice niceties of the industrial / technological age, it's hard to get away from having your data everywhere. And so you need to protect yourself. What are those things you can do? So we need to be better, I think, in the cybersecurity industry to educate the general public and just the layman on that.
Yeah, and I know I've had this experience when talking with friends who aren't into security, right? I used to coach swimming, and I'd sit down with a group of coaches after a swim meet, and we'd all be hanging out, and they'd be like, "Oh, you do cybersecurity?" And it's like, "Yeah, I do." And they're like, "Well, what can you tell me? What's interesting?" And it's like, "Well, everybody uses social media. Everybody does this. You know that if you're on social media, they're tracking this, they're watching this, they're doing this, right? You think it's all private. It's called a private message, but they can read those. Anyone can grab your cell phone data. They can watch your call records. They know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
And they just kind of sit there and listen to it, and they're like, "Yeah, I didn't want to hear that. Like, I just want you. I don't want to know. Don't tell me that.
Yeah.
Just let me be
the ugly truth."
Mind, right? So it's a hard thing where we kind of have to be the bearers of bad news with some of this stuff, where it's like, look, it's going to happen. Your personal data is going to get out there. Freeze your credit, so if it does, they can't steal your money at least, right? Take those preventative measures. Maybe choose not to use TikTok. Maybe choose not to use Twitter or Facebook.
Right.
If you want to go into a whole nother topic, Twitter had a massive breach this last week as well. So, these platforms are getting breached, and there's so much of your information that you just provide for free. So, really just that personal responsibility.
Yeah. Did you guys ever read the book Data and Goliath?
I did, yeah.
I don't remember who that was written by. I'll have to look it up here, but that was for those who are listening, going back to that, you didn't, what Kyle just said, I didn't want to hear that, what his friends told him on being on swimming. It's kind of one of those types of books. But I think that right there is one of those pieces of education. Even being in the cybersecurity industry, until I always realize, information, you go through the 900-page EULA that you sign for that free app so you can make your life easier. It wasn't until I read that book and a few others that I'm like, wow, I guess I never really realized how much of my data I'm just giving out for free because of in tracking, because I want this piece of software that makes my life so much easier. So it's not just, not beating down T-Mobile here with, hey, they were the customers, but we're doing it to ourselves too with all the free apps that we're downloading, and giving them information. And one of the best examples, I don't know if it was in that book or not, might have been a different book that I read, but with all like the tracking you're going to, Kyle, of the information you're giving them and allowing and location services and whatever, it's pretty much no different than we'll call it, I don't know, this social media age or free app age. I don't know if there's a term for it, but where it would be like having you signed a piece of paper and you gave it to this random individual that we'll just say they are with Target. Don't mean to be picking on Target. It's just the first thing that came to mind. And they send a van to sit outside your house and to follow you as you go to Best Buy of 1995, because you don't go to bestbuy.com here now and buy stuff. So they'd follow you. They'd watch what you bought, whether you're using, your cash back then or whatever. I know there's charge cards too, but you're right now to check. Most people now these days use a credit card. So this is kind of what I'm getting at here. You're purchasing tracking. And then they go to the grocery store. They watch what you selected off the shelves. And they go back to your home to watch you get back in your house, what time stamps you're doing. As you go to work, you come back to work. They know your schedule. They know what you're eating. And we do this, not just, for a company like Target or whatever, but these apps that do the tracking services and stuff. And then that data is used to then advertise to you. So the point I'm getting at is that going back to just this T-Mobile thing, just how much data we're actually willingly giving people, and kind of, you put your fingers in your ears and go, la, 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 like your friends, I didn't want to hear that, because of the convenience it's giving in your life. And so, moral of the story, either go live in Alaska off grid and, your new social media is your friendly, furry friends out in nature. Well, I guess except for the grizzly bears, maybe they're the malicious actors. But, it's making sure that, just, again, what can you do to protect yourself and limit that exposure? And that is becoming more popular, with like Brave browser, and you got your Proton VPNs and NordVPNs and those different companies. But even then, I'm starting to see different organizations block those connections, so that way they can make sure to still track your data. So then you go back to that quick hit. Oh crap, I got to turn my VPN off because I need to get to this source of information and give them my data.
I think Amazon does that.
Yeah, I've started noticing that with my particular VPN provider I use. And I'm like, what? This website's blocking me now because I'm connecting through. And so then, fortunately, if I go through a different channel of one of their other VPN servers, then it'll work. So it's like, man, this is making it harder for me even to get to this data. So I don't know. It's this brave new world we live in. I know we kind of got off from our main topic.
Oh, that's great.
Of how the API was used to get breached. But I think the moral of the story is that we're seeing so many data breaches going on that it's a slew of problems. And we as a society globally are just trying to go so fast and make life so easy that, going back to what you said, Nick, security becomes an afterthought. And is that really maybe costing organizations more money than what they realize in the data breaches?
Totally. Yeah. And that book was Data and Goliath. That's Bruce Schneier. If you listen to our Data Privacy in a Modern Era, like the whole first half of that presentation basically sourced off this book. So a lot of those stories that we tell, a lot of the types of data, what they're doing with it, the analytics that they're putting into your big data. A lot of it comes from this book. So super worth a read. If you haven't read it, we can put a link to that in the show notes as well.
The only thing it would be, it's going back to the PayPal thing, but I think it's the same conversation.
Yeah.
In a way,
totally.
It's, the only thing I could have thought of is maybe talk about if there was more technology stuff. I know we started getting more on the
policy side.
Yeah, the policy and morality. I don't know how you want to call it. Not morality, but I guess policy and behavior side of the world. I maybe only touched for 5-10 minutes on the whole technology side of just, least privilege and stuff. But a lot of that stuff comes down to that. I think and that is just key in these breaches. And, I think if the article is that we would have talked on was like, vulnerability or exploit and things like that, maybe we could have gotten geekier on it. But a lot of these breaches are, most of the time, I can't say most of the time because I wasn't at the organization, but from organizations I've seen and just kind of try to dig into, a lot of it comes down to policy, procedure, and least privileged access.
And I think it is a least privileged thing, but it's also it says in the article, they had access from November 25th and discovered it on January 5th.
It's crazy.
So, they had almost a whole month and a half in the system to pull data via the API where there was an ongoing breach that wasn't known about. That's a very, very long window, right? So while, there's probably an issue with how those tokens were generated for the API access and something either got leaked or brute forced or stolen somehow for them to get that access, or maybe there's a vulnerability that nobody knows about in this specific API platform. Again, we don't know how that happened, but there's also a problem of detection here, right? Because if you see 37 million records being accessed from somewhere you don't recognize, usually that sets off alarm bells, especially in the defender's mind of, if you're doing your job and you have the detection capabilities and you're logging what you need to find these things, typically you'll at least get an IP address of where these things are coming from, where they're going to, regions, you name it. And maybe these attackers were very good and had a lot of extra information and were able to blend into the environment. But when it's so many records like this over this period of time, you have to think there was a chance to detect it. And again, we don't know the specifics. So I'm just, throwing out ideas as someone who's worked on the Blue team for a few years now as well. Well, thank you, Matt, for joining us here today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we hit on 1,000,001 things and didn't go nearly deep enough into any of them to do them their full justice, but very much appreciate having you on here.
I appreciate it.
If you want to, thank you. If you want to hear more of the audit, feel free to find us wherever you can find a podcast. We're on Spotify, Apple, even I think on Amazon now. And if you want to learn more about IT Audit Labs, what we do, find our links to our socials, go ahead and head out to itauditlabs.com. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
A well-designed framework will reduce organizational risk and improve overall security posture. Contact IT Audit Labs and have us lead your team in outlining a strategic approach to remediate organizational risk.